Everybody's ready. Let me extend a welcome to everyone, presenters and audience, to Critical Theory and Pre-Modern Chinese Literature. I'm Steve Roddy, corresponded with many of you. I'm usually at the University of San Francisco. Currently, though, I'm at the Kyoto International Center for Japanese Studies. So it's 12:30 a.m. where I am. This wasn't very good timing for me, but I'll do the best that I can. We're being sponsored, as you know, by the Journal of Chinese Literature and Culture, JCLC, which plans to publish these papers in a special issue next year. And our editor-in-chief, Cai Zong-qi, is with us today, although for him it's also very late, 11:30 in the evening. So we're not sure how long he can be with us. So I'd like to turn the floor over to him first to make a few remarks and welcome everyone. So, Cai Laoshi, the floor is yours.
Well, don't call me Cai Laoshi, okay? And thank you very much for leading the event, the program, and I'm just happy to play the second fiddle and let you to preside over the meeting. And for a very selfish reason, probably I am early to bed and early to rise person, and I do not know how long I can remain awake. So that's an apology, and really I do not have much to add, except this I think will be a very exciting volume, a very exciting issue, because a lot of scholars would like to know what other scholars are doing, and I think it's long overdue for us sinologists to reflect upon the impact of critical theory on our field. I think the timely and maybe more sophisticated application of Western critical apparatus may be what define us, as opposed to Asia-based scholars. So I think probably our colleagues would be also, a colleague in Asia would also be interested to find out what we have got to say on the subject. And I'm very keen on. Maybe I get very excited. I'll stay to the very end to set a record. Yeah. So I look forward to hearing, your excellent talk, and read some of the paper. They're excellent, and I'm sure, and there will be an exciting event. So that's Steve. Is enough?
Yes, I'm sure you'll.
我因为完成任务，完成你交的任务 ，Steve. Yeah.
Sure, I'm sure you'll have more to say. We'll have some lively discussions over these next few hours. Well, thank you again for the privilege of serving as the moderator for this event. And I should mention that this is the first symposium sponsored by JCLC, but it's actually the fourth in a series that's started really under the leadership of Yuan Xingpei at Beida. He conceived the project that this is really a part of, the project called 中国文明传播史, and it's being sponsored by his institution Beida, but specifically the International Academy for Chinese Studies there. And I should say it's the fourth in the Euro-American division of this project. So there are other divisions focused on Southeast Asia, East Asia, and I believe even West Asia, and they're all holding workshops too. So it's a pretty big project, a pretty big deal. And once the pandemic is behind us, we plan to hold a follow-up in the glorious Dayatang at Beida. So we hope that everyone can join us there, and let's hope that's sooner rather than later. So as Professor Cai said, this is going to be a marathon session. I'm sure we're all pretty much used to having online Zoom conferences these days. And today's will be a a total of about 6 hours with a break in the middle of 30 minutes. And we'll try to take a couple of breaks too in between some of the papers as well. So thanks to all of you for your stamina and your commitment to this project. So we'll have about half an hour for each presentation, roughly 20 minutes or so for the presenters, and then about 10 minutes for questions, and we'll try to hold to that. So please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, either electronically or if you're visual, then we'll see your hand hopefully. And of course, we have the chat box open, so if you'd like to pose comments and questions there, I'll try to monitor that and keep up with them. So without further ado, let's get started. And our first presenter is Professor Grace Fong of McGill University. Her topic is Feminist Theories and Women Writers of Late Imperial China, Influence and Critique. So Professor well, Grace, please take it away.
Thank you, Steve, and Zong-qi for inviting me to this, this symposium, as well as the volume that will come out of it. I have to start with an apology. I didn't manage to finish my paper. It's been a daunting year, as you can imagine. Sort of administrating and teaching and trying to do research at the same time for the past year under the pandemic. But here we are. Can I share my PowerPoint?
Yes, everyone is now a co-host, so you can go ahead and share, I believe,
okay.
freely.
Let's try. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah,
yes.
Okay. Now I think I have trouble doing the full screen, so maybe we'll just stay with this. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
All right. So I apologize for this and also for my unfinished paper, but there we go. So I'm start with sinology and feminism, which is basically my preamble for the paper. And I don't have very much beyond that, but I can share what I'm thinking of doing for the rest. So prior to the 1980s, studies of classical Chinese literature in the Western Academy focused on a well-established tradition of canonical genres and authors from the classical period, beginning with the Eastern Zhou dynasty to the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The authoritative narrative written by eminent scholar Liu Dajie, 中国文学发展史, first published in the 1940s, remains a canonical work in Chinese studies or sinology. As pointedly noted by Maureen Robertson, whose work will be discussed in this paper, but not today. So she says, in the 1,355-page edition of his History of Pre-Modern Chinese Literature, a history that spans over 2,500 years, Liu Dajie mentions only 5 women who produced literary texts, none of them from periods later than the Song dynasty. Although we can safely assume that these women have not strayed into literary history because they were mistaken for men, it is clear that given the extraordinary disproportion between the number of men and women represented, these 5 have been included as honorary men. They have, for literary and social reasons, been considered to have met criteria derived from and sustained by men's literary culture. So in this broad context, the emergence of the field of writing women in late imperial China in the late 1980s and 1990s was an opportune confluence of several significant events. First was the 1985 republication of an indispensable research tool, the comprehensive catalog 历代妇女著作考 by scholar Hu Wenkai. It was first published in 1957, whose catalog records individual collections of writing by more than 4,000 women Of these, only 110 are from antiquity to the end of the Yuan dynasty. The rest are from the Ming and Qing periods. As a consequence, Kang Yi-sun reacted, quote, "No nation has produced more anthologies or collections of women's poetry than late Imperial China." Hu Wenkai noted that many of these writings, recorded in local gazetteers and other sources, were lost or he had not personally seen them. Others were apparently still extant. Most importantly, the publication of Hu's bibliography raised contemporary awareness of the significance of literary women in China's past as cultural producers and consumers, and the possibility of doing research on them. Second was the access given to foreign scholars in this period of opening up to locate and conduct research on women's extant writings that were kept in rare book archives in major libraries in China. Actually, many are in local libraries as well. And third was the intersection of Chinese literary scholarship on Ming-Qing women writers with developments in feminist theory and criticism in the Western Academy, which is the focus of this paper. The first two events together enabled the rediscovery of a significant number of extant collections of writing, especially poetry, the genre par excellence for women in the Ming and Qing. The third, the intersection with theorizations and studies of women's literature during the second wave of feminism, energized, if not directly influenced, research in this new field in Chinese literature. While there have been studies and translations of the honorary men included in Liu Dajie's literary history, such as Ban Zhao and Li Jingzhao, and even a few other women poets in China's past outside of the canonical purview, the idea of a women's literary culture was not apparent. The first study on this idea and the subject of women's writing in late Imperial China appeared in the journal Late Imperial China in 1989 in, quote, the epistolary world of, it's up on there, female talent in 17th century China. Ellen Whitmer recovered a loose network of literary women based in the southeast region of Jiangnan, whose letters with poems to each other were included in an epistolary collection compiled by male scholar literati. Whitmer showed that these women not only kept in touch with each other, but also provided each other friendship and mutual support across temporal and geographical distances by exchanging letters and poetry. This revelation questioned the May 4th narrative of the oppressed traditional woman, dominant through much of the 20th century. In conclusion, Whitmer pointed to these women's implicit challenge to traditional thinking about gender and creativity. While Whitmer did not reference any specific feminist theory or critical study, her statement reflects an effort to recuperate women's agency in late Imperial China. Looking back at this early intervention, Whitmer reminisces on what led her to this research, besides her discovery of these women's letters with this remark, because I asked her. At the same time, there was feminist theory making its way into my consciousness. We may ask, and I did, which feminist theory made its way into Ellen Whitmer's consciousness in the late 1980s and 1990s? Feminist theory was never singular. It was also far from focusing exclusively on literature. There was a plurality of theories from different disciplines, schools, and ideologies, from post-structuralism and deconstruction to psychoanalysis and Marxism, among many others which informed feminist theory. In random order, Whitmer recalled Freudian theory, people like Judith Butler, Simone de Beauvoir, Gloria Steinem, and Ms. magazine, Betty Friedan, even politicians like Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, they opened up whole new ways of thinking about the world, that women are no less people than men. Their combined effect was to make me think, why not use my training to look into what women were doing during the Ming and Qing? End quote. Feminism has retained its political and social activist roots from its beginning in the mid-19th and early 20th century in Britain and America, the so-called first wave. Its motivation for change, for the advancement and equality of women, socially, politically, and intellectually, broadly informs critical and theoretical elaborations in academic discourse. In Whitmer's personal retrospective, we hear the impact of the inspirational and open-ended dynamism of feminism and feminist theory on a scholar of Chinese literature. So this symposium provides an apt venue to reflect on the confluence of feminist theory and criticism with the field of Mingqing women's literary culture since the 1980s and 90s. The difficulty with writing about this topic is twofold. On one hand, feminism or feminist theory is not one thing, but many. As Paul Smith puts it in his book, Discerning the Subject, quote, feminism is, I don't think I would put him down. Feminism is an internally heterogeneous discourse. Many aspects are concerned with questions of identity, subjectivity, and agency. Feminism's very diversity can and did become conflictual and fractured, resulting in dissenting and oppositional positions and trajectories. In her 2003 book, Literature After Feminism, feminist literary scholar Rita Felsky observed, the field of feminist criticism is ever more fragmented. Many scholars focus on a specific genre, field, or subgroup of women, or alternatively spend the time deconstructing or endlessly qualifying the concept of women. Judith Butler's wary statement, if one is a woman, that is surely not all one is, pretty much sums up the tenor of much contemporary feminist work. Now, on the other hand, when we turn to the side of sinology, there was not any systematic, let alone programmatic attempt to, quote, apply feminist theory to Chinese literary studies of the past. But individual scholars did take up theoretical concepts and approaches, including subjectivity and agency that Paul Smith mentioned, that were germane to explore and analyze issues and questions in women's literary writing in pre-modern China. In this paper, I will address two broad areas, I think, in the appropriation of feminist concepts and theories, some of which feminism has itself appropriated from other theories and discursive practices. One strand includes broadly questions of literary history, authorship, canon formation, etc. The other includes a group of terms and concepts of concern to feminist theory and criticism, such as voice, gaze, subject, negotiation, and others, that are deployed by literary scholars in their analysis of women's texts of Imperial China. Okay, so when we turn back to the late 1980s and 90s, the time when scholars in Chinese literary studies began sustained research on women writers in pre-20th century China, feminist critical theory and approaches were already contested among Euro-American scholars, critics, and theorists. In her influential 1985 book, Sexual Textual Politics, feminist critic Toro Moy introduced, discussed, and critiqued two main approaches in feminist theory and criticism. On one side was what Moy terms Anglo-American feminist criticism, represented by the work of Elaine Showalter, a literature of their own, British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, and that of Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, the Mad Woman in the Attic, the women writer and 19th century literary imagination. Then on the other side was French feminist theory, privileged by Moy and represented by the writings of Hélène Cixous, Luce Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva. Briefly, the theoretical foundation of French feminist theory was Lacanian psychoanalysis, and there reaction to it, in particular Lacan's theory of male subject formation and phallogocentrism, in which women is, quote, black without the phallus. In the form of l'écriture féminine or feminine writing, Cixous and Irigaray practice celebrated the jouissance of the female body, idealized, if not essentialized, in their conception. Christopher theorized the feminine, what she calls semiotic language. It's a very special use of that term. This language is fluid, even chaotic, that is found in mostly in modernist avant-garde poetics. So she holds up canonical male writers and poets such as Mallarmé, James Joyce, and Antonin Artaud. Given its orientation, French feminist theory's relevance lay elsewhere. It is not surprising that it held little theoretical or critical resonance for scholars engaging with the rediscovered pre-modern women's writing in classical genres. So it, in 1990s, women's writing in China, so there's the trend of body writing was very much sort of connected to or influenced by, engaged with the l'écriture féminine. So we turn back, right, to Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own was critiqued by Toro Moy for the unstated theoretical framework that a text should reflect the writer's experience. So there's a lot of debate around this concept of experience, which Moy considered a reflectionist or empiricist approach, essentializing by its biological determinism. However, Moy did praise Showalter's contribution to feminist criticism and literary history, with her emphasis on the rediscovery of minor or forgotten women writers. Showalter provides an impressive biographical appendix of 200 Victorian women writers, mostly novelists, many of whom had been forgotten in dusty corners of libraries. Her book delineates, in her words, the female literary tradition in the English novel from the generation of the Brontes to the present day. Showalter seeks women writers' repeated themes, topics, patterns, images, and proposes a teleological literary history in 3 progressive phases, which Showalter claims is common to all literary subcultures. According to Showalter, for Victorian England, there is first a feminine phase of imitation and internalization in which women write according to the ideas and values of the dominant culture. So think Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. Those are her examples. Then a feminist phase of, quote, protest, in which women writers resist these ideas and values and begin to find their own, which includes the suffragettes movement, 1880 to 1920s. And last, a female, what she calls a female phase of self-discovery, when women turn inward and search for identity. So think Catherine Mansfield and Virginia Woolf. And then up to the, in the second edition, she brings it up to the present. In spite of Moy's critique, Showalter's women-centered and socio-historical approach and her archival efforts to recover minor literature, of course, in her case, it's women's fiction, turned out to have broad impact on the literary field in general. A Literature of Their Own was followed a couple of years later by what became another classic of feminist literary criticism, Sandra Gilbert and Susan Bubar's massive tome, The Mad Women in the Attic. In their preface, the co-authors stated that they found what began to seem a distinctively female literary tradition in their reading of women's writing from Jane Austen to Sylvia Plath. They found recurring patterns of claustrophobic images, metaphors of confinement, and the figure of the mad women in the attic from Jane Eyre, which they read as a literary double that represents the rage and what they call anxiety of authorship felt by the women authors writing in a male-dominated literary tradition and living in a misogynistic world. Significantly, Gilbert and Gubar refer to the work of Elaine Showalter and another early feminist critic, Ellen Moyers, as having demonstrated what she calls what they say is 19th century literary women did have both a literature and a culture of their own, but there was a rich and clearly defined female literary subculture, a community in which women consciously read and related to each other's works, end of quote. In spite of the difference in language, genre, and subject matter, their discovery and articulation of a women's literature and subculture could hold appeal and possibly be useful in thinking about this phenomenon across time and space in other social and cultural contexts. So I'm come to my last slide, I think. Sorry, right, here we go. In 1990, at a conference on Ci poetry, sinologist Tim Wickstead delivered the paper, The Poetry of Li Qingzhao, a woman author and women's authorship, which was published in the volume Voices of the Song Lyric in China, edited by Pauline Yu in 1994. Wickstead engaged explicitly with the conceptualization of a, quote, distinct female literary tradition, right? So taken from both Elaine Showalter and Gilbert and Gubar. In Song China, and the question of women's authorship raised, by Gilbert and Gubar, only to disavow both. So he says, he opens his essay with a series of questions. The poetry of Li Qingzhao prompts fundamental questions when viewed from Western perspectives, especially feminist ones. Is there a separate women's literary tradition in China? If so, what is her place in it? Has her corpus of writings been viewed as being specifically female? And has it been viewed differently by men and women? Is there a distinct female consciousness operative in her writing as well as that of other women writers? In what sense, if any, might she be viewed as being feminist? And finally, what light might analysis of her work shed on current Western theoretical debate about women's writing, which is often couched in universalist terms? Wickstead should be recognized for his early efforts to engage with Western feminist theory, but his choice of Li Qingzhao, one of the honorary men in Liu Dajie's literary history, and the near total loss of Li Qingzhao's writings make for an improbable subject for the inquiry. By the 1990s, his questions also rang essentialist and ahistorical, transcultural. Wickstead asked if Li Qingzhao referred to other women poets before or during her time, and if later women poets cited her or modeled her song lyrics on hers, drawing evidence from meticulous and comprehensive Chinese sources on every mention of Li Qingzhao as evidence. By the end of the essay, Wickstead answered the questions he posed, that there was no separate female consciousness or a separate female literary tradition. He admitted that perhaps these questions could be raised about women poets in the Ming and Qing as they were beginning to make their appearance in the field. 20 years later, feminist critical scholarship also informed Ronald Egan's magnum opus, The Burden of Female Tradition, the poet Li Qingzhao and her history in China, in which he acknowledged in the introduction. The reconsideration of Li Qingzhao's life and works presented in this volume owes a substantial debt to feminist literary criticism and scholarship, as it has developed in recent decades outside of Chinese studies. Discoveries about the meanings found in writings by women in Europe and America before the 20th century, including well-known writers and those long neglected, have been valuable in clarifying gender dynamics and biases against women who write that are certainly not unique to China. My So my unfinished paper ends here. What I intend to consider further in relation to scholarship on the literary tradition in China is to turn to literary culture and the inclusion of women, exemplified by the Cambridge History of Chinese Literature, edited by Stephen Owen and Kang Yi-sun Zhang, in which there is a section in the second volume on women's literary culture. Wilty Damer and Beata Grant's The Red Brush, Writing Women in Imperial China, a literary history composed of, I call it a literary history, but it's a lot of translations, right? But it functions somewhat like a history composed of translations that are contextualized by biographical sources of the women writers. So that's on the micro level, and also by their concept of the so-called two high tides of women's literature in the long 17th and 19th centuries. So that's at the macro level. In the section on what I intend to write about on critical terms and theoretical concepts, Maureen Robertson's pioneering scholarship in the 1990s, especially her two articles, Voicing the Feminine, I don't give the subtitle for lack of time, and Changing the Subject, are models of theoretical thinking and analysis that continue to inspire young generations of scholars. I will also reflect on my own theorization of women's authorship and gender in my book, and Li Xiaorong's theorization of the gray or inner chambers, boudoir, if you like, in women's poetics, and then Yang Binbin's representation of women's re-inscription of exemplarity in their books. The latter two belong, so Li and Yang, to the, I would call the second wave of scholars in the field of women's literary production in late imperial China. These new trends of scholarship are exciting and producing many new insights into the tradition. Our scholarship both draws inspirations from, as well as questions and diverges from feminist literary theory and criticism. And so these are some of the issues that I will continue to explore in the remainder of my paper. Thank you, and I look forward to, since it's unfinished especially, to your feedback, your suggestions, and your questions. I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Yes, I did it for you. So
Oh, okay.
I think I'm okay. Yeah. Great. So we have a little bit of time. Let me just do this, and I'd like to invite questions and comments from the audience. Thank you very much for a scintillating overview of this wonderful paper. Yes, Martin, please go ahead. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Grace, for the very, very nice paper. Nice to see you again.
Martin,
So,
yes.
I think my question I probably can ask to every single of our papers, but I ask it to you because you gave the first, and that is, when we talk about our topic today, we are talking about how to apply certain theoretical models to our study of Chinese literature. And I would be interested in how you see how our doing so can actually speak back to those theoretical fields, in particular, in your case, then, feminist scholarship of literature. What can the China field contribute?
I think, we certainly, are looking at different language, different culture, different time period. So what we, the insights that we come to that could, in fact, question or bring out the differences between the Chinese case and the Western case. So let's see one. This example. I mean, the feminist scholarship, but of course we can't. As I was saying, there's so many aspects to it. It changed. Feminist literary criticism. It has changed over time, but say in terms of the picture that one gets from the Gilbert and Gubar, I mean, living in a misogynist world, women were going mad in their attics. They've been so repressed and so on and so forth. So there is this antagonism between the genders, between male and female, between men and women. However, so when we shift the focus to China's literary culture. So, for instance, Kang has argued that, in fact, it is much more of a cultural, what she calls a cultural androgyny. That, in fact, there is not, of course, there were male scholars and critics very much opposed to women's education in China, right, throughout the Ming and Qing. But the trend, right, the force that we are now excavating is that there was a lot of interaction and support, right, between, from the male scholars and literati for the women. And so that, so she looks at it as, like this androgyny, so the mixing, the coming, the blending of male and female in their efforts. And on the one hand, perhaps she, that's an article she wrote, I think again in the 90s, by the Ming and Qing, there's a sort of feminization of the male literati culture. And at the same time, when women were taking up the writing and the reading and the production, that they are entering into sort of the male, what traditionally would have been designated as the male sphere, right, of activities. And so she also sees that kind of change. But how do we get that across to the Western scholars? We are always looking at what's happening, but do they look at us? I don't think very much after all these years, in spite of all the criticism that has been, aimed at, and the conversation between the feminists is Gayatri Spivak. They are on a very, very theoretical level, the subaltern, like what. So they are more open to, now race, is one intersection that one has to consider, not just gender and sexual, so on and so forth. But how, I think, I always feel there is, I talked to some of my colleagues in the English department, and I think that on an individual level, there we have intellectual exchange, but I wish we could, maybe have some kind of joint comparative conference and to have a real conversation together, because our publications are in our venues and they don't read them. So how do we, What's your experience though? Maybe it's different from feminist kind of conversations or lack of them.
Well, I don't want to monopolize more time, but I think maybe in early China, in early China, it's becoming slowly a little bit easier because the study of antiquity is becoming more globalized and more comparative with every passing day, and China has a big place there now. But I realize this might not be the case in many, many other fields.
Yeah.
Thanks. I have to intervene here. We are just about out of time, but maybe we have time for a very short question. We have two, but let me assert my privilege and ask Paula to just briefly pose a question if you'd like.
Okay. Actually, this is, I think Martin's question is the key question. And I think, Grace, that was a wonderful answer. It is, the thing that's been on my mind the most as I've been writing is, who are we writing for? And who are we talking to? And where are we getting our information from? Who's our audience? And who are we? What is our standing? This is becoming a very current issue with identity entering into the picture now. Is what is the individual China scholars standing to say anything to anybody about what it is they're studying? Things have become so fraught, and in a way, I think it's true that from the point of view of feminist scholarship, that's almost like the vortex of the question. So my actual question, I just wanted to make that comment, but my actual question is whether or not I don't think you can do this in the context of this paper, but do you think that there's any relevance to the questions that you're raising to be gained from studying the representations of women in the literature, in Chinese literature itself? And I'm thinking particularly of Ying Zhuan, of Yuan Zhen's Ying Zhuan, but also of Ren Shi Zhuan, right? Chen Jiji's Ren Shi Zhuan, where the depiction of women has been read as possibly having some kind of feminist overtones. And so whether or not this is relevant, of course, depends on who we're writing for and what, but anyway, I just was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Is that completely outside of your realm of questioning?
Oh, not at all. I think there's a lot of interest still. I mean, you say that these representations of like women like Ying and Ren Shi in the Zong-qi, right? That it's you use the word feminist, but I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Feminist. No, that was a shorthand, but I meant it as a shorthand for they seem to be portraitures of women that ask for a deeper investigation and kind of pull away from that actually suggests a subjectivity that that goes beyond
the stereotypes.
Yes, thank you. Right.
Right, and I think actually in terms of fiction, there are scholars and young scholars who are very much interested in reading. They would call it agency, right? In the subjectivities of these characters of women.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Another kind of like a whole different genre, right? And
yeah, well, thanks. I'm going to have to cut us off here. I'm sorry, and Alex, I hope you'll keep your question and ask it in the chat. So let's move on. Thank you very much, Grace, for a great introduction to your vast topic here. So we're going to move to our next speaker now. Professor Yanxin Da of Denison University is going to speak on Secrets Laid Bare, Close Readings of Chinese Poetry. So, Professor Lian, you can share your screen with us. You should be able to do that.
Great. Can you see my PowerPoint?
no,
Not yet.
Oh,
it's I think Steve's PowerPoint that's showing.
Right. But you should be able to
probably
overwrite it. Let me
you need
see.
to end your. I think Steve, you need to end your share screen.
Ah, sorry. Yes,
Stop it,
that's
and
right.
then the other people
Let me
can.
just see if I can do that.
Okay.
And share.
So Steve, you can see it, right?
Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks to Steve, to Zong-qi, and to JCLC. Many thanks to everybody. What a wonderful opportunity. My topic is close reading and classical Chinese poetry. So because I'm mindful of time, so let me get to the close reading right away. When talking about new criticism and close reading, we cannot but think about I.A. Richards and his interesting experiment of allowing students to read poems without knowing anything about the poem. Sometimes he did not even give students titles of the poem. Yeah. And suppose this is one of the poems I.A. Richards gives to his students. And what would he expect from his students? Yeah. I think the first thing the students will find is that this is about a male eavesdropper listening to the singing of a girl. And seems that she is singing a love song, and true love is expressed in her voice, in a light and lovely voice. Yeah, because into every note she seems to put her fragrant heart. But if the student reads more carefully, you will find that there is a problem because her voice is forced, and so there is a crack. Yeah, and how can you express your love and sing what you like to sing with a forced love? So if the student is good enough, he will find that there is another person present besides the eavesdropper and the singer. And if there is three is a drama. Things becomes interesting. Yeah. For the eavesdropper, the song seems to be sincere, but he's not quite sure. And if we look at the ending of the poem, seems his frustration and his concern is genuine. Yeah, good students should find that this person, this eavesdropper, must have been here before, must have been on the other side of the curtain. Otherwise, he would not be able to have this kind of detailed description of the room. And precisely because of this, the music, the song, will encourage him and exasperates him at the same time. But the ending is quite interesting. Maybe the ending is true, is genuine. And so seems everything is here. Ambiguity, tension, paradox, and this seems to be a good stuff for close reading. Yeah. And for students from I.A. Richards' classroom, the task, the mission of interpretation seems to be accomplished. But for Stephen Owen, yeah, whose comments, whose reading of this poem we just went through, yeah, this is just the beginning. This poem, yeah, for close readers who refuse to look at outside elements, outside evidence, yeah, they would not know that this poem is not just another poem, but a song lyric. And a song lyric is for entertainment, is to be sung by a singer at a banquet or a pleasure quarter. Right? And this song has been sung and will be sung again and again. Yeah. And so there is an issue. If you believe in everything, then you are credulous. But if you don't believe anything it says, then you are cynical. Right? Yeah. And Stephen Owen does not just pay attention to the genuineness of the female voice. He also pay attention, yeah, reading the poem in the original might help. But what is important is you need to take the context into consideration. Yeah. And the ending of the song lyric, yeah, has at least carries a ring of truth. And so Stephen Owen compares this to the expressions in the 诗 poetry. Yeah, the comparison is inevitable. Yeah, because shi is used for you to express your intent, right? But now when we compare shi and ci, yeah, we can see that shi could make the assumption of genuineness, but song lyrics cannot. So actually, Stephen Owen has a good opportunity to talk about so many things that were discussed in literary history, right? And everything starts from here, from this small crack in the text. Without this, Stephen Owen would not be able to talk about so many things. And this is the kind of close reading now everybody is doing. And is it important? Yes, maybe it's very, very important. For example, this is something I've read from a publication in 2015. The author should have known about Liu Yong, about the singing tradition, about the genre features of Ci, but still, this article says that the female voice is genuine. Everything is true, as if we are talking about a game of flirtation between a stupid kid and a coquettish singer. Yeah. So to avoid it, maybe we need close reading. And the reason we still have this kind of reading, yeah, that do not get to the real issue of the work, maybe it's because the text is so familiar, is so transparent to the readers, right? We already know everything about Liu Yong. We know this Ge Lianting, right? So the interpretation is just intuitive and automatic. Yep. And Owen's reading at least made the poetic language strange and wonderful again. Yeah. And now I know, consciously or unconsciously, everyone is doing close reading. Yeah. But when Hans Frankel published his paper on Cao Zhi's poems, yeah, about half centuries ago, yeah, he has to emphasize that this is about a new approach, new at the time, but actually it was almost the end of the heyday of the new criticism, right? Yeah. The trend changed at the time. And about that time, or in the early 60s, yeah, there is another force of close reading, yeah, in the field of classical Chinese poetry. Yeah. And this force is very conscious, very self-conscious, very purposeful. Yeah. Its purpose is not to use close reading to appreciate poetry, but to reveal the secret behind the mechanism of poetry. And the purpose is this. And when you look at this, maybe you know who I'm talking about. Yeah, it is Gao Yougong and his collaborator, Mei Sulin, right? And this word aesthetics is his coinage. Yeah, and what is this? Yeah, in the publication in 1986, yeah, Gao Yougong made this manifesto of his search for truth in the study of classical Chinese poetry. Yeah, this is too long, so that's just summarize it. Yeah, first he says that the aesthetics is an interpretive code. The author uses it to express himself, and the readers use it to interpret, to understand the poet, right? And then he says, this is difficult, almost impossible to articulate. Therefore, it excludes the uninitiated. Okay, if you are not good enough, you will never know what this is. And this sounds very familiar because this is, you just cannot say it. It's there, but you cannot say it. But anything unexplained beauty arouses an irritation in me. Okay, so Gao says that I just want to make the impossible possible. I will explain it. In order to do it, I need to look at the text. So here we have this. First, there is a code there. Second, almost impossible to decode. Third, but I want to make the impossible possible. And the fourth, I need to examine the text closely. And actually, we know he's talking about close reading. But this close reading is very different from the close reading from the new critics camp. Yeah. Gao Yugong and Mei Zulin, they claim that they own to Emerson, Richards, but also maybe also Wimsatt, maybe also Roman Jakobson, right? And I believe they are very conscious of the speech made by Roman Jakobson at a conference in Bloomington, yeah, at Indiana University, yeah. In that speech, Jakobson envisages the beginning of a new kind of close reading, yeah. That is the linguistic criticism, yeah. Actually, maybe this kind of criticism has more to do with the so-called stylistic analysis that is still thriving in UK, in England, right? But for some mysterious reason is ignored in the States, right? So from the very beginning, Gao makes claims that he and his collaborators will use new criticism to do a linguistic study of literature, yeah? And this is of macro scale, yeah? It has a big purpose, yeah? And the scale is wide, yeah? He will find a system, a mechanism, yeah? And this, yeah, these are some of the things Gao and Mei claimed to do. First, they want to talk about the local organization of words. Second, the so-called texture, that is the coordination and interaction between the local organizations, yeah? These are the focus of their study, yeah? Gao and Mei says that, say that they will not really talk about structure, but actually they did, yeah? So let's look at what they did, yeah, with the first topic, yeah? In these two papers, mainly in these two papers, they make these findings, yeah? Basically, it is about ambiguity, right? Because of the relationship between the words, because of the weak syntax and strong texture, yeah? Also because of the discrepancies between the surface grammatical structure and the deep structure of meaning. Ambiguity is the norm in Chinese poetry, especially in recent style poetry, yeah, instead of the exception, yeah. And what did I do with texture? Yeah, I need to use an example to illustrate this, yeah. This is a good example, yeah. Gao and Mei, they use Jakobson's principle of equivalence to examine metaphor and allusion in recent style poetry, yeah. Okay, when we use language, yeah, we do it by using two principles. The first one is the principle of combination. Words are combined together to form the speech flow, right? Yeah. And then there is the axis of choice, the principle of choice. Yeah. We can choose words that are similar or different from the words we are using, we are talking about. Yeah, verbs can be chosen. Yeah, and also the subject can be chosen. The object can also be chosen, even the articles, right? And so we are talking about the axis of selection and axis of combination. Yeah, what happens in poetry? In poetry, says Jacobson, the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. Equivalence is promoted to the constitutive device of the sequence. And use Chinese as an example. Yeah, I can see so many things at the same time. I can also hear something. But when I write poetry, this happens. Project into the axis of combination, and the result can be this. And Gao Enmei uses this poem as the best example of the use of equivalence, principle of equivalence in the Chinese poetry. Yeah. Okay. They find that all these images are related to each other. Why? Not because they are about the same thing, but according to their finding, Chinese images in Chinese poetry tend to refer to quality instead of things. And the quality of all these images are similar. They are cold, they are white, they are transparent. And how about this linglong? Even this is not an object, but the word according to 说文解字, yeah, because of the jade radicals. Linglong means the jingling of jade, right? And linglong can also be used to describe female characters, right? So all these words are related and they are organized along the axis of selection. Yeah. And actually, the two axes, yeah, interact with each other. And it seems to me that, oh, okay. And Gao Enmei says that actually this principle works much better in Chinese poetry. And actually, they prove that it does not work in Western poetry, because Western poetry can have this kind of equivalence in formal features, in alliteration, in rhyme, in antithesis, but it cannot work with meaning, because for Western languages, it's different from Chinese language. And seems to me, every time when Gao Enmei prove that Western theories works in Chinese poetry, they are more interested in the reconfirmation of the special features of Chinese poetry, not to prove that Western theories can work. Yep. So this seems to me is the deep structure of Gao Enmei's literary thinking, the deep structure of their literary criticism. Everything they talk about involves this antithesis between the spatial and the temporal, between selection and combination. They are very interested in the interaction between these two principles, two elements. So we can look at some of the terms they use, look at some of the issues they discussed. It's always about this, yeah. And the most interesting antithesis can be found in the contrast and comparison between the regulated verse and the unregulated verse. Yeah, Gao and Mei do not really discuss the ancient style poetry, but Paula Vassano has a very interesting chapter in How to Read Chinese Poetry about the difference between the regulated and the regulated verse. Yeah. And Gao Yugong in an article talks about this. So actually, he says something about structure. Yeah. In this article, yeah, which seems to me one of the most important articles by Gao Yugong. This is just ingenious. Yeah, I like this paper very much. He says so much in so few pages, yeah, about so many things. Yeah. In this article, he talks about two things that are antithetical to each other. One is the regulated poetry. The other is the unregulated verse. Okay, how can we describe the regulated verse? It is regulated. It almost occupies a space, right? So I'm borrowing from the title of Clint Brooks' book, yeah, The Whale-Rock Urn. It is a whale-rock urn, a piece of art, right? And how can we describe the ancient style poetry? We cannot have an image because it is not spatial. Maybe this spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It is a flow, not a design. And Gao says that the difference is between that of design and that of melody. You can see the two principles. Okay, and we can talk about other things related to this antithesis: literary writing, literati writing, and folk singing, right? And we can put everything together and see the antithesis. Okay, now in this article, Gao wants to talk about how when literati got interested in the folk singing, when they find this media very powerful, they try to reform it and make it their own. In other words, they want to appropriate it and make it their expression. And how did they do it? Yeah. In order to do that, they need to do something. Okay. In order to change the folk singing into literati expression, they need to do this. And then the function will be changed. Okay. Expression of public experience will be changed into expression of internal personal feelings. Okay. And they will do things to make the flow into a design. And eventually, the early song lyric was transformed into something that was more and more like regulated poetic form. Yeah. And eventually, it did become a regulated poetic form. Yeah. It is highly regulated, but it is different from regulated verse, right? With more powerful expressive capacity. Yeah. And what is the function? What is the role played by Xiaoling? Yeah, by the short song lyric. Yeah, it is here. Right. So in this article, Gao talks about many things, but mainly because talks about the two principles, how they interact with each other. Yeah, he promises to do more with this. Yeah, says that this will be the topic for another paper, but unfortunately, he did not have the time to do this. Yeah, fortunately, there are later comers.
So I'm sorry, if you could just wrap up in the next minute or two so we can have time for questions.
Okay, yep. And before we talk about, okay, so let me rush. Before we talk about the achievements of the data commons, let's look at this. Yep. This is a couplet from the 1900 poems. Yep. According to the context, we need to read it this way, right? Because the morning wind cannot have the bitter feeling, right? But actually, yeah, because the prepositions are not present, so we need to read it like this. And this is ambiguous reading. It is not literal reading. And suddenly we find that morning wind and crickets are actually the topics from the Book of Songs. And the morning wind really talks about bitter heart. And crickets really talks about the shortness of time. So this is the verbatim reading of the line. And suddenly we have two kinds of readings. And actually we are talking about, I need to run. We are talking about the conflict, the antithesis between topic common and subject predicate relationship. Yep. And actually I'm talking about Zong-qi's work, right? His project of revealing the secret behind Chinese poetry from the very beginning to the song lyric. Yep. And I guess we are quite familiar with this, so let me skip, right? But I also think, again, I think this is the deep structure of Tsai's critical thinking. It's always about the interaction between the topic common principle and the subject predicate principle. Yeah, it can be used to explain so many things. Yeah. So let me skip. Yeah. Tsai talks about how the topic common structure is used in the sentence level, on the sentence level, then on the stanzaic level, and finally on the overall structure of a poem. And not just in Shi Jing, but also in the pentasyllabic poetry. For instance, we have this number 12 of 1900 poems. We have this structure, yeah, binary structure. We have the topic common structure. And actually, this structure can be used to explain almost everything, yeah. And the overall structure, yeah, can be seen in the organization of this book, yeah. Sorry, I need to skip so much, yeah. But if we sum up, we can say that Tsai's project, yeah, is macro, yeah. He wants to use close reading to reveal the secret, which is what Gao Yugong tried to do. Yeah. And let me have 2 more minutes. Yeah. This can explain everything. And Tsai uses it to explain this term. What is this? This is so unspeakable, but this is Liu, right? This is Zhuan, and this is Yuan Mei Liu Zhuan. Okay. I need to rush to the end. Yeah. And this is my last screen. Can we look at this? Yeah. This is what Wimsatt says at the concluding chapter of his book, Verbal Icon. He says that a good poetry should be like this. It should be rounded. And I think rounded means Yuan Mei, right? and you will see the interaction between the logical and the counter-logical. And I believe he's talking about this. The logical Liu and the counter-logical Zhuan. And so why we can use new criticism's idea of close reading to examine Chinese poetry? Because they fit. This is a perfect fit. Chinese poetry can stand close reading, can survive close reading. Actually, it invites close reading. I do not know where did Wimsatt get this idea. He did not know Chinese. So I wonder, where did he get all these wonderful ideas? Okay, sorry about time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that fascinating close reading of so many different texts. So we are just about out of time, unfortunately, but we can take a couple of questions, I think, if anyone would like to pose them. Well, I think we're all digesting all this. If no question, Lucas, yes, please.
Hi, thank you. I learned a lot from that paper. I don't want to propose, just for your last question, where did Wimsatt get this idea about sort of rounded readings or Yuan? But I don't want to say it was Wimsatt himself, but a lot of the sort of the new critical ideas and teaching texts without context, a lot of the sort of the early new critical figures taught in China for a while. And so it might be worth doing a little bit of background research into sort of who those kind of figures are and sort of what some other ideas were that may have been developed in China to teach English poetry to second language readers, and then some of which may have sort of been kind of refit back into the well, you know, into the sort of the canonical tradition once new criticism became dominant, and then sort of turned around to be applied to Chinese to the study of Chinese literature. At the same time, I recognize you're doing two things, right? Close reading can accomplish, or you know, close reading as you're doing it, as you're talking about it, covers new criticism and structuralism. So maybe I don't know, that itself might require some fitting, but that may be a suggestion for further sort of work.
Thank you. Thank you. I need to apologize for the concluding remarks. Yeah, that was meant to be at least not very serious. Yeah, I left out an example by Emerson, and Emerson actually lived in China. Yeah, even though he has prejudices against Asian languages, right? He once used English, and he created a news article title, something like Italian terror assassins bomb, something like that, right? And he says that we have English words, but actually I'm using English words as Chinese, right, using Chinese grammar to organize English words, right? That might be some kind of simplistic reading of simplistic understanding of the special features of Chinese characters. But at least he realizes that because of the special features of the Chinese characters and the Chinese syntax and the formation, the way people create poetic images, right? He knows that his 7 types of ambiguity can work very well with Chinese poetry. Yeah. Yes, so you're right. Yeah, a lot of efforts are spent on this field. And in Zong-qi's recent book, Yu Fa and Shi Jing, he goes over all those attempts, including Ezra Pound's and others, right? How to use the special features, yeah, maybe eccentrical features of Chinese language to explain the Chinese poetics, right? Some of them more successful than others, but in the final analysis, seems that they circle around the most important issues, right? Without getting it, yeah, but they contribute to this interesting exploration. Yep. Yes. Yep. a lot needs to be done to include all those Western efforts from Western scholars, yeah, to discuss, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Lian. That was a preview, I think, also of what we'll be talking about more than once over the next few hours. So we're going to have more to say, I'm sure, on many of these topics. So let me thank you and move on to Professor Jeff Moser of Brown University. His title is On the Possibility of Chinese Image Theory, excuse me. So please go ahead, Jeff, and share your screen.
So I'd also like to begin by thanking Stephen and Zong-qi for organizing this gathering and for inviting me into the illustrious company that they have gathered here. My paper today is part of a larger project in which I'm trying to imagine what a history of Chinese art might look like if we were to begin from emic concepts internal to early Chinese thought. What could a history of art be, for example, if we were to begin not with the preeminent categories of the European Renaissance, painting, sculpture, and architecture, but categories derived from the ways in which early Chinese texts talk about the making of things? The first question that one would want to ask when approaching such a problem would, of course, be whether it would be appropriate to call this alternative history a history of art at all. I mean, isn't the very term art so laden with value assumptions of the Western tradition as to trap the visuality and materiality of Asia within an epistemology of European origin? And yet I would argue that it is important to contest the meaning of art for the simple reason that millions of people around the world now practice what they call art. And this great community deserves a term that is both categorically permissive and, more importantly, conceptually pluralistic. One that not only includes non-Western categories of culturally valorized expression within its remit, but more significantly, endeavors to reconfigure what art itself can mean and do, not only in the hands of contemporary artists, but as a mechanism for reawakening past potentialities in the scholarly and creative praxis of the present. Now, such a history might be organized, for example, as a history of the design and crafting of the various devices involved in the practice of the 6 arts, those being ritual, music, archery, charioteering, writing, and mathematics. Now, all of these arts deployed a host of different implements whose shapes, dimensions, and adornment were matters of considerable interest to the literate communities of early imperial China. That history would not presume a distinction between the history of writing and the history of calligraphy, for example, nor would it propose to carve out ritual art as a category discrete from all other kinds of art. It might, to the contrary, argue that all art worthy of the name art is ritual. And it might define creativity in terms that had far more to do with being ethical than being novel. It might pay particular attention to things like pictures of ritual implements and musical instruments and archery equipment in the illustrated exegesis of the Confucian classics. What would it mean to recenter this material in a way that recognizes the inescapable fact that no other single body of graphic material received more textual attention in early imperial China than the illustration of ritual things? That the pictures in a text like Nie Chongyi's Illustrations of the 3 Ritual Classics have been studied principally as graphic footnotes to the history of classical commentary says far more about the limits of our own episteme than it does the visual imaginations of early China. Now, such a history would also interpret early Chinese assemblages of things, such as the terracotta army, not simply according to our received understandings of representation, naturalism, mimesis, verisimilitude, and modularity, but through reference to the range of meanings associated with concepts circulating in the late Warring States era. This terminology would be mobilized not only to help explain how and why the Qin regime chose to bury the first emperor with a life-size representation of his army, but more pointedly to ask the question of whether or not it is appropriate to consider the army a representation of anything at all. So it is at this point that my line of reasoning, that the project intersects with the theme of our gathering today. Now, our overall aim, as stated in Zong-qi and Stephen's invitation, is to provide an analytical survey of various significant theoretical and critical paradigms that have shaped the development of non-Chinese language scholarship in the field of Chinese literary studies. Now, as an art historian, my own interest in this question is driven by a concern for the ways in which critical theory has pushed themes of visuality and materiality, which have historically been the preserve of art historians and archaeologists, into the broader purview of the humanities, and the consequences that this has had for both art history and for literary studies. Now, W.J.T. Mitchell sums up these critical trends as follows. The turn that Frederick Jameson describes from philosophy to something called theory in the human sciences is based, I think, not only in a recognition that philosophy is mediated by language, but by an entire range of representational practices, including images. For this reason, theories of imagery and of visual culture have taken on a much more general set of problems in recent decades, moving out from the specific concerns of art history to an expanded field that includes psychology and neuroscience, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and theories of media and politics, toward what can only be described as a new metaphysics of the image. Now, this generates a whole new reading of philosophy itself, one that could be traced to such developments as Derrida's critique of photocentrism in favor of a graphic and spatial model of writing, or Deleuze's claim that philosophy has always been obsessed with the problem of the image, and thus has always been a form of iconology. Now, for those of us who practice, or in my case, dabble upon invitation in the field of pre-modern Chinese literary studies, while we might not always have Derrida's critique of phonocentrism at the forefront of our thinking and our practice, we are all familiar with the implications that this and a series of related moves in mostly French theory of the 60s and 70s have had on our field, or on our fields, I should say, encouraging attention to such themes as the materiality of writing, a theme that is essentially organized around the recognition that every act of reading is simultaneously an act of looking at the graphic expression of text on a particular material surface. A simple way to characterize the turn that Mitchell is describing is to say that it has become increasingly difficult for literary studies to think about literature without also thinking about images. Now, what this imagistic turn in theory has failed to adequately recognize, and this is a failure that some of us in Chinese studies have perpetuated, I think, in our effort to apply the insights of critical theory to pre-modern Chinese materials. And here, this may be the beginning of an answer to the question that Martin Kern asked earlier in our session today, is the degree to which the metaphysics of the image that Mitchell describes is premised on a particular intellectual genealogy of the image, one that is bound up with the theorization of the mind as a representational organ, and thus with the idea of representation more generally. So consider Mitchell's working definition of the image. The image, he writes, is a highly abstract and rather minimal entity that can be evoked with a single word. It is enough to name an image to bring it to mind, that is, to bring it into consciousness in a perceiving or remembering body. Panofsky's notion of the motif is relevant here, as the element in a picture that elicits cognition and especially recognition, the awareness that this is that, the perception of the nameable, identifiable object that appears as a virtual presence, the paradoxical absent presence that is fundamental to all representational entities. Now, for Mitchell, the picture is in the world, and the image is the representation of that picture in the perceiving mind, the meeting point, if you will, between the descriptive work of perception and the denotative work of language. Now, the basic paradigm underlying Mitchell's reasoning here echoes through many of the most foundational 20th century works of art history and critical theory. And one could have listed literally thousands of works here, and I've just given a couple key points, a couple key texts that I've been thinking through or thinking with. It is there with influential art historians like Erwin Panofsky and Ernst Gombrich, and it undergirds a wide range of media theories building on the linguistic foundations laid by Wittgenstein and Saussure. Now, while close reading clearly demonstrates a tremendous number of subtle differences between the ways different modern thinkers conceptualize the image, Panofsky, for example, would probably disagree with Mitchell's equation of images with motifs. These superficial differences mask the more fundamental shared assumption that representation is fundamental to human experience, that the representational work of literature and art is mirrored in the representational work of the mind, and that the problem of mimesis, in an essential sense, the question of the relationship between a thing and its copy, is fundamental. It is certainly present, even foundational, in works as varied as James Elkin's The Domain of Images and Hans Belting's An Anthropology of Images. It is not an accident that Erich Auerbach's classic Mimesis, the representation of reality in Western literature, enjoys the status of being, in the words of Frederick Jameson, one of the half-dozen most important literary critical works of the 20th century. So, if the linguistic turn of 20th century philosophy has now been followed by a turn to the image, and if it follows that the broader rise of theory constitutes a shift from inquiring into nature to inquiring into the mechanisms whereby nature is made knowable, then I think it would be safe to say that we are living in an era in which it is very difficult to think without thinking in terms of representation. Now, the challenge, as the work of people working in comparative philosophy like Roger Ames and Hans Lenk and Barry Allen have demonstrated, is that if we are going to grapple with the prospect of telling a history of Chinese art in more emic terms, then not thinking in terms of representation is precisely what we have to do. What I would like to suggest is that by explicitly theorizing, and more importantly, philosophically foregrounding the idea of the image, critical theory, or at least in the guise presented to us by someone like Mitchell, has made it both harder and in fact more important to interrogate the horizons of the image in early Chinese thought. And I think we could see this really clearly in the way scholars struggle at the intersection of translation and interpretation, where they are attempting to split the difference between rendering a term in language the English reader can understand without limiting the term with the reigning epistemologies of English discourse. We see this exquisitely clearly in the ways in which scholars of early Chinese thought have grappled with the meaning of the term xian. Now, there are, of course, numerous texts that one could explore at this juncture, but given the amount of time available, I'm going to focus on just one, both because of the complexity of the way in which it uses the term, and because it has been the subject of a significant amount of scholarship in English. And that text is, of course, the commentary on the attached verbalizations, or the Shi Zi Zhuan of the Classic of Changes. Now, given the audience here today, I'm going to assume a basic familiarity with the changes and get right into the nitty-gritty. Now, as Willard Peterson demonstrated in a classic article 40 years ago, the commentary makes a number of significant claims. Now, the most important of these is that the solid and broken lines of the hexagrams constitute the polarity of positive yang and negative yin, and that the interaction of these essential forces is responsible for all cosmic processes. When one writes about the changes from the representational perspective of modern theory, there is a tendency to semioticize statements like this by saying that the lines constitute figures for the polarity. But in order to grapple with the productive strangeness of the text, we must begin by accepting that the text does not, in fact, make a clear distinction between the hexagrams and signs and the processes that they signify. To the contrary, the essential distinction between sign and referent that undergirds both classical Western understandings of mimesis and modern semiotics is almost entirely absent from the way in which the changes characterizes its hexagrams. Thus, modern scholars of the changes regularly stress that the text engages in a conflation of sign and reality, in which its constituent elements have an unmediated correspondence to the world. Now, this unmediated correspondence is sometimes characterized in modern literature as a kind of doubling, whereby the realm of heaven and earth is duplicated by the processes at work in a change. Both Willard Peterson and Mark Lewis talk about it in these terms. Here are the references if you need them. But even this sense of doubling is itself a product of our own attachment to the notion that representation is separable from reality. What the changes says definitively is that the alternations of positive yang and negative yin in the hexagrams are the processes of the world. That what one witnesses in the combinations and recombinations of lines is not ontologically distinct from what one witnesses in the change of seasons or in the waxing and waning of the moon. Now, the attached verbalizations makes a number of claims about Shang. The Shang were what Fuxi observed, or Guan, when he looked up to the heavens. Although Shang were thus visibly apprehensible to Fuxi, the text does not clearly indicate whether ordinary human beings could also see them. This is a question that would become a key point of contention in later Song Dynasty interpretations of the changes. But regardless of their relative visibility, the text does clearly indicate that the Shang are fundamentally real, not constructs nor mental projections, but again, in the words of Willard Peterson, genuinely out there in the fabric of reality. This reality was encoded in the changes, and that process of encoding, whereby the Shang were manifested in the patterns of broken and unbroken lines, was also called Shang. Thus, the term Shang refers to both that which the sages perceived in the fabric of reality and the process by which those perceptions were shared with others. For this reason, Anglophone scholarship on the changes has tended to translate Shang as either image or figure, insofar as both terms have the capacity to express something that is visibly apprehensible, an image, a figure, and the process of imaging or figuring, whereby that apprehension is visually conveyed to others. Now, images also supplies a perniciously commodious vessel for one of the most essential claims in the attached verbalizations. And this is the assertion that the changes are a matter of imaging, and imaging is a matter of resembling. 意者上也,上也者,上也. The classical Western association of images with semblances maps so easily onto the statement that it can lull us into thinking that an analogous representational logic is at play. But the key to uncovering the logic of the changes is to avoid naturalizing the representational logics that our conventional understandings of images and semblances carry with them. Through a series of parallel passages, the attached verbalizations explains how the sages took as a measure the numinous things generated by heaven, how they emulated the flux and transformations of heaven and earth, how they shunged the shung that heaven hung down in the stars. The text thus treats Shang as a kind of emulation. It goes on to explain that these emulations generated the hexagrams, and that you're all familiar with the story, and that the hexagrams in turn inspired the sages to create buildings, clothing, plows and weapons, to domesticate animals, to devise writing, rites, and systems of governance. The hexagrams, in short, are presented as the wellspring of civilization, the inspiration that's made the sages worthy of being called sages. Having perceived the Shang, the sages established Shang, or Li Shang, in the world. Now, nowhere does the text contend that these emulations constituted second-order derivations of the real from the ideal. Nor is there a sense that the sages were divinely inspired artists on the model of Vasari's Michelangelo. The only thing that made them sages is that they were better than other human beings at following models. What this implies in turn is that all the models that mattered for the creation of civilization were already out there in the generative processes of heaven and earth, and it was simply a matter of noticing and following them. The models that the sages made were not representations of the models that the sages saw, but unadulterated transmissions of those models in changing forms. Taking seriously the changes' use of Shang means imagining images not as pictures or figures for something that exists elsewhere, not, that is, as representations, but as ongoing, almost viral revelations of the essential processes of sustaining life. So, what would be the implications of imagining images as revelations rather than representations? What would it do for our scholarship? Well, for one thing, I think it would mean that literary studies would still need to take images seriously. Not because images participate alongside writing in mediating the relationship between thought and reality, but because they would be understood to coexist with writing and ritual and measuring and making on a continuum of moral means. We would be less inclined to ask the question of how writers represent ritual, and more inclined to examine the ways in which writing does what ritual does. We might, and this would, I admit, be a challenge, have to give up on the idea of the text in favor of the pattern or perhaps the formula. Art historians, for our part, would have to take seriously the implications of the fact that the catalogers of influential court collections, like those of Emperor Huizong, invoked the changes as an explanatory paradigm for all the artworks contained therein, and developed systems of visual interpretation modeled on the changes' use of Shang. Now, of course, starting from the changes is just one possibility for an alternative theory of the image in China. Early Chinese texts use the term Shang in a host of different ways that are interwoven with other terms like Wen and Tu and Xing and Zhi and Zhao. Any serious theory would want to take those terms into consideration, and this is especially important, it would want to be honest about what it was excluding from its theoretical structure. But even if there's no way for a theory to be fully inclusive of the diversity of views that populate any moment in the history of China, that doesn't mean that the effort isn't worthwhile. For if we are serious about reckoning the theoretical and critical paradigms that have shaped the development of Chinese literary studies, then reckoning what those theoretical and critical paradigms have excluded is just as important as reckoning the new perspectives and acknowledging the new perspectives that they have provided. Telling an alternative, more emic history of Chinese images would not be an objectively better history than the one we already know. But it would help us to see more clearly what the history that we know has excluded. This alone, to my mind, would seem to make the effort worthwhile. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for a very scintillating talk. And we have some time for questions, so please.
Steve, could you tell me how to raise my hand on the computer, on the Zoom? Is anything? I just don't want to just barge in.
Sure. Well, since you're there, let's let you go first. It should be under.
I need to learn how to raise hands. Which?
Zong-qi, it's under reactions.
Reactions, right?
At the lower right. Yeah.
And then.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you
okay.
click there, you see raise hand.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you. Yeah.
And then you have to lower your hand again afterwards because it doesn't go away by itself.
Okay.
Thanks,
then
Martin. Yeah.
Your lower hand, which one?
No,
you
just press it again and it'll lower it.
Just go for it.
Okay, lower hand. Okay, sure. Okay. And may I just, raise my hand also verbally and also graphically, image.
Sure.
Yeah. And thanks very much, Jeffrey, for your excellent talk. And I really agree with your argument about the trans-visual notion of image. I think it's not until the arrival of the influence of the Buddhist Zhaoxiang, the Chinese really, the earlier Chinese tend to really look down upon the visual image, just like the I Ching, the annotation, and the disagreement about the Han, the Xiang Shu Pai, is they try to identify the hexagram. The hexagram with a particular image, animal like horses and ox. And then in the Xi Ci Zhuan, that image is really a mental entity, a mental comprehension of the cosmos, rather than any visual representation. And this is also you can find in Lao Tzu too. The 大象 is the 仿佛 is 没有形的大象，大象无形。So it's not really predicated on the visual object and the relationship to the visual object. So in Plato, so the whole idea of representation, talking about the bed, that's a visual image. So the visual image becomes a kind of reference point. But in the Chinese tradition, the image is more like a kind of a transvisual grasp of the secret of things. I think probably on this account, probably we can take issues with Western notion of the foundational significance of image. And this image is really not that visually grounded. But of course, this change after the Buddhist 造像, then you like a 中饼是花山水序, then you can talk about how the proportional relationship between the real object and the representation that can carry spiritual significance, and then the visual object can also be the embodiment of Sakyamuni. So you can see that. So I think that laid ground, I think, for the town idea, the notion of 意象 to emerge. I think the town's a lot of notion of 意象 has more to do with the Buddhist idea of image than the traditional Taoist image of the, yeah. So this is basically, you know, what your paper, you know, evoked in my mind, the ideas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would say that what prompted me to start thinking along these terms was actually an interest in the way in which different Song theorists, people like Susher, people like Cheng-yi, read the changes. And I think absolutely it's very clear that they're coming to the text with something that we might consider to be analogous to representational concerns in mind. And I think you can actually really see that in the way in which they struggle with some of the ambiguities in the core text itself.
Thanks.
Also
Paula, excuse me. Zong-qi, go ahead.
Just one more remark. And one of the essential difference of image, Chinese notion of image and Western image, is they consider like the Xi Zi Zhuan, the image itself, you know, is embodied with endowed with reality. So that's why it's a 天道、人道、地道都是在意境里面。Okay. 意境里面的文那个 graphic sign, the graphic sign is something that comes after the 圣人立像, and then you have 这个像 first you 观相得天下之责 and 得相, and then you create that kind of symbolic graph, and then after that then you have 习字. So it's the grounding is really the 相 in the mind of the sages. And so that's endowed with reality, and that's kind of the essence of the call. Well, maybe I shouldn't use the word essence. The ultimate secret of the universe are really unlocked by the sage's image. Yeah.
Thanks. Can I call on Paula now to ask a question or comment? I think you're muted still.
I realize that we're very, very short on time, and so I will keep this question short. I want to say this was an amazing paper. I was just blown away by it, and the question that I'd like to ask is, well, the thing that came to my mind while listening was that the difficulty of translating the phenomenon that you're describing into English, or into forgetting about English, even just contemporary critical terminology. We're so limited in our ability to do that. And so one of the ideas that came to mind is that similar or analogous arguments were made back in the 80s by Pauline Yu in particular in her, I see you're nodding your head, so you're very familiar with this. And so then I'll just abbreviate my question. Do you see a connection there, and do you think this means that metaphor is a completely, because this is the feeling about her position has been much debated, and so do you think that that's an appropriate reaction to the kinds of things that you're noticing, that if metaphor implies immanence and you're rejecting the notion of immanence as a representational model, then does metaphor just fall by the wayside? Is synecdoche, as Stephen Owen more recently argued, a better model, or do we have to just invent a new word altogether?
So we should really have an hour-long conversation about that question.
I
But
think so.
the short version that I will give is that I actually think that there are terms of literary analysis and terms in semiotics, especially things like the idea of the index, that are actually really useful for parsing some of the processes at work in specific early texts. But in order for them to actually have purchase on the way we're thinking, it feels like you have to kind of sort of decontextual, or sort of pull them apart and sort of unpack sort of Persian approaches and sort of re-scramble them, so to speak. And so that when you end up doing then is sort of using a text like the I Ching to point to the assumptions of the theoretical construct, and it's much more of a kind of dialogic structure, a dialogue. And I think I certainly wouldn't suggest that terms like metaphor, synecdoche, or any of these don't have value, but I think that value is mostly realized in dialogue. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, I think that's great. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you. I think now is a good time to take a 5-minute break. So let's do that and come back in my on my clock here. We'll be coming back at 31 minutes past the hour. So please take a bathroom and coffee break, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
It looks like I'm not sleepy now.
I think this is too stimulating for you.
So I may have trouble, even when I want to go back, I may have trouble fall asleep. So I may as well stay on. Yeah.
Too many thoughtful ideas.
So many stimulating ideas.
Great. Yeah, I'm gonna get some tea. I'll be right back. Okay, I think we're ready to resume. So our next speaker is Professor Paula Varsano of UC Berkeley. Her title is Semiotics and Formalism in the study of Tang poetry from the 70s to the 90s. So Paula, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Steve. And I also want to thank Zong-qi. Echoing what everybody has said so far, this is wonderful. And I'm just sad that we're not in the same room together. I can feel, the desire to just burst into conversation that so many of us have, and we're not really able to do that. And it's just too bad. So I really look forward to, our next meeting in person. I hope that really does happen. Also, thanks to Yuan Xingpei for being at the origins of this project. So the first thing I want to do is change my title. I kind of put that title out there as a placeholder, and it's not inaccurate exactly, but I think, oh, and also I'm going to be in the spirit of Jeffrey Moser's presentation. I'm going to be depriving you of images today. You're just stuck looking at my face, or you can turn that off and just listen. I don't have a PowerPoint to share. The new title of my talk, and I think of the article that will come out of this, is The Elusiveness of Commonality, Late 20th Century Sinology and the Search for a Shared Lyric Language. So perhaps the first thing to talk about here is why I changed the title. And I felt that the original title suggested that I was going to summarize the arguments that were made, or perhaps evaluate them. And I felt that trying to imagine who the audience might be, and thinking that the audience is probably mostly people in the field of pre-modern Chinese literary, historical, aesthetic studies, I didn't really see a point in doing that. And so I thought that what I'd rather do is try to figure out what the underlying goals, what the motivations were behind the methodological and strategic choices that were made in the course of this period. And also, it really is from the 60s to the 80s, more than the 70s to the 90s, is something that I discovered. I do end up with a kind of teleological narrative, but I think in this case that's really appropriate, because people are writing in the context of their teachers, of what they've learned from their mentors, both those they've taken classes with or who've advised them, but of course their predecessors as well. And so what the goals and parameters of this paper, and here I join Grace Fong's club. It's an unfinished paper as of yet, but the goals and parameters are that that I'm going to be interested in the tensions that emerged during this period over the issue of disciplinary definition in a field of Western-based scholars who dreamed of an unmediated relationship with the integral world of the Chinese Empire, and increasingly came to yearn for a way to accurately and responsibly codify and communicate its riches to the intellectual world with which they interacted most directly, whether that be in fellow scholars of literature, fellow historians, people unfamiliar with China, but who are working with texts in similar ways with similar questions. Ultimately, I became sensitive to the complicated relationship that Western-based China scholars writing about these texts, Chinese texts in English, had, and I think still have, with the very act of drawing any kind of boundary around what we do, let alone with where we would place such a boundary. The shorthand for this boundary issue can be found, of course, in the binary that became manifest in the 1960s between sinology and philology on the one hand, and the disciplines, in this case, literature and literary theory on the other. So because of this focus, I have to first of all caution that this is not a literature survey of the field. My presentation is going to leave out many an important and worthy scholar working on Chinese literature during this period. And instead, I'll be looking primarily at how the field of Chinese literature, and particularly the study of Tang poetry in the West, tried to find its footing, establishing particular types of permeable boundaries and modes of literary commonality by incorporating the possibilities provided by the formalist, structuralist semiotics approach, which Professor Yuan laid out in such great detail, into the study of Chinese civilization as a holistic entity. The boundaries were much debated, as we all know, and there is even a degree of bitterness and ungenerous caricature thrown into the mix. But the specific terms in which these boundaries were being prodded and shifted made possible the development of a much enriched vocabulary through which to read Chinese poetry, one that we are still benefiting from today. And so this paper is going to proceed in 4 sections. The first will be the earliest public self-interrogations on where the boundaries of Chinese studies can and should be drawn, as handed down to us in the form of published comments by scholars who participated in the 1964 symposium called Chinese Studies and the Disciplines. These comments were published in the Journal of Asian Studies. And unlike most papers that we all write today, they're very short. They're like 5 pages max. So they're really to the point. There's a polemic there that's quite revealing of the times. Second part of the paper, I'm going to be talking about what happened over the course of the 1960s and 70s and how literary studies became the breakaway discipline through the agency of James J.Y. Liu at first, and then Gao Yougong and Mei Zulin in what we call the linguistic turn. And then picking up on that, the 70s and 80s, we will show how what their work actually allowed for the absolute outright embrace of comparative thinking in poetic theory and practice, as we see in Stephen Owen and Pauline Yu, but also I'm going to be bringing in, not so much in the presentation today, but in the paper, François Cheng and François Julien. And then finally, the questions that this is all going to raise for me is, how do we think then about Zhang Longxi's quest for the gesture of comparison without dualities? That is, the question of whether traditional thematic categories were a hidden way of overcoming dualities in the first place. And here I'm thinking about material culture, beginning with, say, Edward Schaeffer, or the category of nature poetry, gender and sexuality, as Grace was talking about earlier, questions of memory, representation, and so forth. So that's how the paper is going to roughly go. So to begin with that symposium that I was mentioning before, Twitchett, Dennis Twitchett, professor of Chinese history, opens up this little cluster of papers. And I should just mention, by the way, that this symposium was attended entirely by Chinese historians. There were no literary scholars at the time, but that may well be because Chinese literature as a discipline really wasn't fully formed yet. Everybody was, of course, in area studies programs. But nevertheless, these were actual historians. Dennis Twitchett's essay called A Lone Cheer for Sinology is essentially a plea, not in defense of the bad bogeyman of pre-war sinology, but for something much more, I think, generous-minded, which is the unity of Chinese studies. He argues for the need to defend its integrity by treating it as an organic whole. The ultimate goal being, and here I quote, the imaginative restoration of China's past in all of its infinite variety. So he's careful not to refuse the value of the disciplines, but he makes a plea for something that today we might call interdisciplinarity. Frederick Mote kind of takes this further in his essay, The Case for the Integrity of Sinology. And he wants to completely exile the disciplines completely. And he does so, and this is very interesting to me, by means of a metaphor in which he compares sinology to a map and argues that that map has natural boundaries, much like the Chinese empire itself. The goal of the sinologist was to penetrate that boundary by means of the acquisition of language. And it's interesting that in this part of his paper, he actually calls that site of possible penetration the Great Wall. So much for the natural boundaries. But this is, he may have been playful here, you know, I'm not, it's a little bit hard because these are such short papers. It's a little hard to know what the tone was, but language was the mode that would give you permission to penetrate these boundaries. And then once you're within those boundaries, the goal of the sinologist was to, and I quote, go native. That is, to acquire the depth and breadth of textual knowledge that would have been assumed among those living in that world at that time. This is the most explicit example one might think of binary thinking. It's very easy to caricature. It became, of course, a perfect site of attack, cloaked as it is, of course, in a language that prizes integrity and wholeness. But I would also want to point out that the willingness that he is expressing here to shed his own barbarian identity and make himself useful to and conversant with the epistemological standards of those native to that world, past and present alike, has to also be taken with somewhat seriously. And I think, as much as I object to, you know, retrospectively to certain things, there is an active generosity here that I think is worth looking at. People who stood up for this believed no less perhaps than their perceived adversaries. They were very scared. I mean, you feel the fear and the passion and the anxiety in these essays. They believed that understanding could be obtained by adhering to a disinterested stance of scholarly objectivity. And they believed that such an achievement required nothing less than taking on the subjectivity of their object, if that makes sense. At its extreme, what looks to us today like the arrogant appropriation and transformation of a designated other was intended to be the very opposite, a desire to be appropriated and transformed by a culture and by values that lay beyond oneself. This too is an aspiration to wholeness. And this is where I think we begin with all of the anxieties that we feel around setting boundaries around our discipline. What do we exclude? What do we include? And as I mentioned in response to Grace's paper, you know, who has standing to make any claim to knowledge to begin with? Well, in that same symposium, Joseph Levinson actually pushes back already against the establishment of the particular boundaries that Fritz Mote was putting up. He recognizes from the outset that these boundaries set up around sinology, perhaps they were intended to protect the subject's integrity, that is China's integrity, but in fact, he recognizes that this was ultimately going to be very detrimental to the subject, to anyone's understanding of it. And here I offer a quote. "The sum of the matter," says Levinson, "is this. The world is a world, not the sum of illogical areas. Sinology as a conception will not do, not because China ought to be bleached out of its individual significance, but because as an individual, China belongs now in a universal world of discourse. The sinologist is entitled to be very reserved about easy universal analogies, but he should entertain comparisons, if only to give his particular field a universal context. Only then, when the creative life of China is studied in something more than a sinological spirit, will Chinese civilization seem not just historically significant, but historically significant. A purely, quote, sinological form of admiration of Chinese culture may amount to denigration." And then finally, I'll leave the symposium in a second. I just want to, there were a lot of people there. Benjamin Schwartz was there, but Mary Wright, in her very short 2-page intervention, or 3 pages, Chinese History and the Historical Vocation, the solution that she offers to this difficulty is, in fact, to render coeval, if not coterminous, the field of history and the field of sinology on the basis that the methodology was the same and that neither could be adequately pursued without the other. So I can't go into detail into why she says that here, but if we have time in the Q&A, I'd be happy to. Otherwise, it will be included in the article. Moving on now to what happened in literary studies, in this context, in this moment of urgent self-questioning, we have, of course, James J.Y. Liu's publication of The Art of Chinese Poetry. Now, this was one response to Levinson that Levinson himself may not have anticipated. And I'm not saying that Liu actually read the symposium, but this is what was in the air. His concern, of course, is to enter the world of Chinese literature, first of all, to create a field of Chinese literature, and to do so by bringing it into the larger field of of literary discourse. And here he says in his introduction, "In recent years, a fair amount of Chinese poetry has been translated into English, and there have even been a few English biographies of individual Chinese poets, but little has been written in English in the way of criticism. This is not surprising in view of the obvious difficulties of criticizing poetry in a language far removed from the one in which it's written." So here already you see that for him, criticism is an act of translation. right? Nevertheless, the English-speaking reader who has acquired some knowledge of and taste for Chinese poetry through translations might well wonder at times, how should one approach Chinese poetry critically? Could one apply to it the technique of verbal analysis now prevailing in English and American literary criticism? Difficult as some of these questions admittedly are, he says, the fact that most English-speaking readers interested in Chinese poetry cannot devote years to the study of the Chinese language. They don't, I'm adding, have access through that gate in the Great Wall into the world of China, seems to justify an attempt, quixotic perhaps, but much needed, to answer them, if only partially and tentatively. Now, I won't go into the details of that book. I assume that many of you know it well, but it's a measure of Liu's optimism and innovativeness that this book was barely noticed by his target audience, which seems to have been the non-Chinese non-Chinese reading reader of poetry. But it was widely reviewed in sinological journals. Pretty much every journal mentioned it. Most of these are non-committal descriptions that point out some technical translation, errors or disagreements, except for two. One is Hans Frankl and the other Donald Holtzman. They weighed in at what as you might expect, were on the surface opposite ends of the spectrum. Hans Frankl was the comparatist. He saw the necessity that Liu points to, and he admires what he calls his common sense. Holtzman, on the other hand, was the sinologist, and he repeats in his review the argument for maintaining a holistic view of Chinese literature in the Chinese cultural context. And he has a quote here that I think is really worth hearing. The critic of poetry must tell us in our own cultural terms what the poem feels like, how it vibrates in its Chinese cultural context, and what it means there. To do this, he must himself be at home in that culture. He must have nurtured in himself, in his sensitivity, those thousands or millions of pores or taste buds that respond to the illusions, the prejudices, the landscape, the social conventions, in short, to the whole complex of Chinese culture. Now, this is a very moving call to what it means to read any piece of literature. And I think that a student of Baudelaire or a student of Tolstoy would also demand the very same thing. But both Frankl and Holtzman agree that Liu's work is very problematic, and they actually agree on why, which is, I think, very interesting. They feel that his approach lacks detail and depth, and that the reader comes away with the sense that Liu's work denatures its own subject and raises many more questions than it answered. So enter in 1968, and Gao Yougong and Mei Zulin's first of 3 co-authored articles, Du Fu's Autumn Meditations, an Exercise in Linguistic Criticism. Now, they made no secret, as Professor Lian mentioned, of their sources of inspiration, Northrop Frye, Empson, Richards, whose extension of structural linguistics into literary theory must have seemed promising to them as a way to make Chinese poetry accessible to scholarly readers. But at that point, if they had that ambition, they kept it really well hidden. It was too early, and I think that that's something that Liu did not really notice. Everything about this article, in fact, seems humble. Its title, it's an exercise, its scope, its stated goals, to find out whether they could uncover the source of Du Fu, one poet's unique late style, by subjecting a key sample to the rigorous application of linguistic criticism. So Gao and Mei supplant Liu's comforting common sense approach with the more rigorous and less generally accessible blend of standards set by the sinological historian on the one hand and the Western trained structural linguist on the other. Without saying as much, though, they are clearly modeling a method of reading, if only experimentally, They have no illusions that non-sinologically trained readers will delve into its complexities. And that may be one reason why they don't offer any translations of the poems. But more importantly, this decision is also, that is to not offer translations, is consistent with their method. To offer translations in an article that bases its literary analysis on the linguistic features of the language in which the works are written, including phonological features, would have just been to undercut the project itself and opened it up. It would have opened it up to all kinds of objections and criticisms. Looking back today, it's interesting to see how this single article set forth a way to execute the exceedingly delicate dance, picking up on James Liu and even Levinson's gauntlet in forging a way to introduce Chinese poetry into an imagined universal discourse of literary studies, while honing tightly to the philological and historical standards of the most rigorous of sinologists, affirming the boundaries, in a sense, as a way of transcending them. Now, the 1970s saw a tremendous diversification of the modes of study of Chinese literature. And in 1975, James Liu published an article in the Journal of Asian Studies surveying the state of the field and arguing again for the importance of a clear delineation, first in terms of whose work is to be included. And to my knowledge, this is the first time this was mentioned. He says that only the works written in or translated into a Western language and with a predominantly Western orientation may be included irrespective of the author's nationality or the place of publication. And we can talk a little bit about that if we have time. And second, in terms of the focus, and here he says, although he considers philological and historical knowledge a prerequisite for the study of Chinese literature itself, the central concern of this new field is the study of the intrinsic qualities of Chinese literature and its development as an autonomous, though not independent, cultural phenomenon. Now, this seems like a matter of emphasis rather than of substance. And as such, the declaration is innocuous enough. But in fact, this type of call for transformation turned out to be both too much for some and not enough for others. But he did, in The Art of Chinese Poetry, open up the terrain for what we can call the embrace of comparison. And that was the delineation and the study of traditional Chinese literary criticism as a subfield. Now, one can easily see how the identification, analysis, and translation of classical Chinese writings on the nature of literature could satisfy the sinologist's insistence on being firmly grounded in native writings, while also attesting to the existence of a higher level, if not transcendent view on literature. So that writings such as the 诗经大序, Lu Ji's 文赋, 文心雕龙, and the best-known 诗话 of the Song Dynasty and beyond seemed at least to present solid rationale for comparing Chinese literary thought with those theories being developed in Western traditions. Now, Liu himself would go on to publish a book-length study on this very subject in 1977 called Chinese Theories of Literature, with this precisely in mind. This time, his work was reviewed in non-sinological journals, as well as those dedicated to Chinese studies, but all the reviewers were sinologists still. And again, the criticisms echoed by and large those issued in response to his first book. Critics bridled at the artificiality of imposing order on a tradition that was anything but orderly, and also at the even greater artificiality of imposing categories drawn from an entirely separate tradition. But James Liu—
Excuse me, Paula, sorry to interrupt, but could you wrap up in a couple of minutes?
Oh, yes. Oh my goodness. I'm
Leave time for
sorry.
questions.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I will just point out that, yeah, I'm so sorry. So as in, so what follows in the rest of this section of the paper is that Gao Yougong and Mei Zulin, in their second article in 1971, Syntax, Diction, and Imagery, they actually open up the possibility. First of all, they offer translations. They're clearly beginning to write for a larger audience, and they anchor their argument both in the linguistic analysis, but also in what Leo had earlier identified as metaphysical theory. That is, they try to bring to bear the notion that the types of linguistic formula that we find in poetry is not something that was just imposed from the outside, but grows out of the entire ecosystem, if you will, of Chinese literary thought. And so they also go on in their article on meaning, metaphor, and illusion. They do ask the question of whether structuralism is a passing fashion or does it have something of permanent value. They respond in the affirmative. And here, I guess I'll just end my presentation here, where they say that they assert that the juxtaposition of two historically unrelated languages and poetic traditions should not, in fact, be seen as comparative, a process one reserves for languages that have something in common, but as contrastive. And in that regard, and this is my favorite part, they say their primary focus is the relation between Chinese language and Chinese poetry. English is used as a way to set forth contrast. And the reason I will just end with that for today is because I would like to recall that one of the major reasons for condemning the work of someone like François Julien, who is very problematic, I will admit, is that he says the exact same thing, except the converse of that. And so the question that my entire paper will be posing, of course, is the value of contrast, how that contrast is offered, who is making it, and is it possible to even have these conversations without some kind of comparative framework? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a little time for questions. The floor is open. Yes, Pat, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very, I think, inspiring talk. One question that I wanted to raise was, so in my travels in translation studies, I found that Elliot Weinberger's volume, 19 Ways of Looking at One Way, is maybe one of the few volumes coming out of, sort of sinological work on Chinese poetry that seems to be widely known and is regularly cited in the works of both translation theorists and also the remarks of practicing translators in other languages. And so I guess my question is that particular work gonna figure into your discussion, since it's originally published in 1987, right? So it could be at the tail end there.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. That's a really wonderful suggestion. I love, who doesn't love teaching with that book? It really does help students, when you have a classroom of students who are both, who know Chinese and then many who don't. This is a fantastic introduction into what we're dealing with in translation without actually saying to the students, don't even bother if you can't read Chinese, which is, that's always the thing that we're trying not to say to them. So I had not actually thought of including it, but that would be a wonderful coda to the paper, I think, because it does precisely open that question of, can you compare without explicitly comparing? And and when you're comparing, you can also compare across analyses and not just necessarily between the sinological and the disciplinary model, or China and non-China, Chinese and English, that this act of comparison is so inescapable to how we try to understand anything. that this would be a wonderful way to just make that point. I think I'll footnote you. I think I might just do this. That's really exciting.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. Thanks very much, Paula, for a great talk. Also, I love the way you begin, because for those of you who know Moat's house in Princeton, he surrounded it with a huge bamboo, really, wall to keep the outside world out. So.
You know, it is, I mean, just like, this is kind of full disclosure, is that most of the people that I'm going, whose work I'm going to be discussing in this article were my teachers at one point or another. And that having come through the academy at this particular moment in the 70s, where I started to understand the types of tensions and I'm sure Zong-qi can also speak to this, and that it starts to work its way into your consciousness, where you really don't know what is right. You're trying to think independently, and you see value on both sides, and you don't know how these things will come together. And so I remember early on being at an AAS conference where the question was raised, are Stephen Owen and Pauline Yu, are they actually Orientalists? And I remember just jumping out of my skin with upset. And so this is really, that moment for me is, I think that's what's motivating this particular paper. And I didn't do such a great job just now in conveying that, but that is going to be, that's the motive behind this paper, is to answer questions like that and kind of show that, the caricatural way of looking at people's efforts to draw boundaries around their work in order to arrive at some kind of meaningful assertion should not be an occasion to label them in ways that just, in an ad hominem way, just discounts them. And I think it's particularly important to make these arguments now, when identity is another thing that's entering into our field again. So I'll shut up. Yeah.
Thanks. No, I think you do that very much in the paper. You're very generous to all of them. Well, thank you so much. So now it's Pat's turn. So let's move to Professor Pat Sieber from Ohio State University. Her revised title, is Whither Theatricality: Historical Legacies, Critical Approaches, and Public Interventions.
Mm-hmm.
So, Pat, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, so first of all, like everyone else, I want to thank Steve and Zong-qi for making me part of these very timely deliberations. And I also, I think we're all in Professor Yuan Xingpei's debt for having had the vision, right, to initiate sort of a large-scale project to look at the diffusion of Chinese culture more broadly across the world. So I should say here that I also feel indebted to everyone else who now has gone before me, and you will see why, because I'm going to liberally take advantage of the issues that you have raised in order to situate my comments on theatricality. So I join Grace's and Paula's club of 2/3 finished paper. So you haven't actually had the misfortune or pleasure of reading this endeavor. But what I want to say here, I think sort of speaks to some of the quandaries that Martin, Paula, and I think Jeffrey also raised. So when Steve and Zong-qi approached me last summer with the assignment of, could you write or contribute an essay to this endeavor, that is the journal, on the topic of theatricality, I thought, oh yeah, wonderful. This will be a terrific opportunity to review what scholars in this sort of new, relatively new field have done, and perhaps we can then also think about what Chinese endeavors or analysis of Western scholar of Chinese drama could contribute to comparative studies of drama. So in other words, you know, the question that Martin Kern raised earlier, namely, you know, this kind of back and forth, right? We apply concepts from borrowed and modified from Western theory, and then we, you know, partly with a view towards trying to enrich and maybe modify the discussion on these topics with people in other languages. So so that was where I was at a year ago. And in the interim, as you know, a lot of things happened, right? So, and here I want to pick up sort of Paola's call for some kind of a reckoning of the positionality from which I'm speaking here, because I think when all is said and done, the sort of the particular juncture that I'm finding myself in, I think is contributing to what I sort of propose as a kind of new audience for at least the essay that I'm envisioning here. So first of all, the first, and I'm going to enumerate a few factors, I think, that have led me to a reconceptualization about what I would like to do in this essay. First of all, before I give it away, you can maybe see it from my revised title, right? Once it was a kind of relatively bland genres, approaches, and prospects, and now I'm much more precise, historical legacies, critical approaches, and public interventions. And it is actually that last element that is public intervention that is partly deriving the way in which I have now sort of structured my essay. So part of the reason I came to this reformulation have to do with my own trajectory as a scholar. So I'm part of this larger project also initiated by Cai Laoshi, that is the How to Read Chinese Literature series. And I'm the co-editor of the drama volume. So in that capacity, I had to really think long and hard, you know, sort of how we want to frame Chinese drama and maybe Chinese theater more broadly for sort of, well, we might say non-traditional audiences. And by that, I mean, specifically, we were charged to think about it in terms of undergraduate students. So which typically, I think when we write, we don't think of undergraduates as our prime audience. But just coming fresh off another iteration of my Chinese drama course, I would say that's actually our bad. That we are maybe not really capitalizing on the fact that this younger generation, I think, brings certain both curiosities and also a certain oblivion to the study of Chinese culture that actually can work in our favor, I think. So that's one thread. Another thread is I've had this sort of being European, as you can tell, originally from Switzerland, etc. I've had this sort of vague fascination with the history of sinology. And when I began this, to pursue this in a kind of more scholarly fashion, you know, American scholars would often ask me, why on earth would you want to study European sinology? This is so dead and sort of beyond the pale of what is worthy of inquiry, aren't you wasting your time? Yeah, so I think, of course, now we've seen that, in fact, the interest in intercultural encounters, right, of between in the early modern era has come to be a major new field. And as is often the case, it seems that our colleagues in art history were among sort of the pioneers in this area, together with historians, people interested in the history of science, and then also of course people who were interested specifically in new Qing history, which involves the study of Manchu. So all of these, yes, this is for Martin Kern, whose teacher, Martin Gim, I actually was one of my early, enthusiastic supporters for re-entering into this realm of the history of sinology. So at the time, actually, when I was first asked this question, I couldn't really, I didn't have enough distance, I think, to this query to really say, okay, here is why we need to do this. But now, sort of, you might say 20 years later, I can, I think, say one reason why it matters is that while we as a scholarly community, or some segments of the scholarly community, might think that this is so passé that we don't need to know about this history, actually, if you look closely at certain, sort of cultural endeavors, and I include theater among these early approaches have actually sedimented into the contemporary public practice of certain Chinese cultural forms. So if we want to be cognizant of how knowledge about China plays out in this public domain, I think we are ill-served by ignoring this early history. And then maybe the third factor that also plays into this is that, so over the last decade, I have consulted for the Royal Shakespeare Company on 2 different occasions. So, the first time involved their production of The Orphan of Zhao, something that became something of a, sort of what we might call massive failure at some level, mostly because they had such dubious casting practices, and where they put all the Chinese characters in these menial roles like servants and dogs, and so this created a huge uproar, but to the credit of the Royal Shakespeare Company, they then sort of thought to learn from their mistakes, and they initiated a Chinese classics project where they now commission literary translators to retranslate Chinese plays, and then commission Asian playwrights with Asian backgrounds, writing in English, to craft sort of modifications, adaptations of these same plays. So far, perhaps the one that has gotten most attention in this regard is The Injustice of Do-e, that was redone, translated by Gigi Zhang, a very well-regarded literary translators of Jin Yong, The Legend of Condors fame, and then the Asian American playwright Francis Cowhig, who also teaches at Santa Barbara. So my point here is that there are certain segments of the cultural, sort of active cultural practitioners out there who have an interest in sort of a more considered approach to what we could potentially do with regard to sort of the Chinese theatrical tradition. So that's kind of another strand. And then my fourth strand, I saw that one of the participants here entered the room with a bracket, "Stop Asian Hate." Right. So I think, yes, the reason we're all here together in a Zoom format, we know why this is the case. But in some ways, I think for me, at a personal level, I think the calculus of doing research on China now has been fundamentally altered. That there is a kind of urgency here that I feel, and I think that working closely with our graduate students, I see it reflected in their voices as well. So this kind of quest of reaching my colleagues in Renaissance theater, which is what I might have wanted to do a year ago, now I don't really see that as my primary audience. So yeah, so instead I think precisely because theater has been such an important intermediary in sort of in this cross-cultural encounter from the very early days of Jesuit missionary endeavors into the sort of the efforts in the 19th century of bringing Cantonese opera troupes to entertain audiences in the sort of newly developing Chinese settlements in California and so forth. So there is this long tradition where certain kinds of knowledge about China is mediated through the form of the theater. So one scholar, Daphne Lay, in her book here, Operatic China, even goes so far, and here, no offense to my colleagues in all the other literary endeavors, right? That, she claims that so-called Chinese opera is sort of the, sort of classic shorthand for everything Chinese. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with that characterization, but I think what we do see here is that maybe theater has this potential to mediate cultural relations. And here I'm gonna share my one slide to say that these questions are not, sort of yesterday's question. Here I'm sharing with you an email that I received from the China Institute in New York. So they are a nonprofit organization that is almost 100 years old, who see themselves primarily as sort of a facilitator of sort of a broad spectrum of Chinese culture among New Yorkers, and now with the pandemic increasingly also with the sort of the world at large. Okay, so here what you see is that there is this, and it's an advertisement, right, for a virtual performance talk with top Broadway and Chinese artists of a new Broadway show that's called Sound of the Silk Road. Now, I didn't know anything about this particular show, but what I think is very interesting is how this show is being, sort of characterized in this advertisement, right, for this talk. So, with top Chinese acrobats, musicians, magicians, and lion-sized puppets, not to mention a West meets East script involving time travel, the show presented unprecedented technical and cultural challenges. So why would I be sharing this with you? Well, so if you look at the, this kind of characterization, this is a kind of Chinese theater without theater. Insofar as you have acrobats, you have musicians, you have magicians, you have puppets, and then you have this kind of, generalized script with, a theme, and the theme is somehow announced here, Sound of the Silk Road, right? So in other words, what seems to be missing here, there are certain things that are missing, right? There are no characters or protagonists. I mean, it could have been that it's about Monkey King, right? But Monkey King is not mentioned here. There's also no mention of language, as a kind of important theme. There is no plot. We I think, come away thinking that this is kind of like a what's the word, a spectacle rather than a play. Now, granted, they use the word show, but it makes almost zero demands on having any kind of prior knowledge about, what we might call now narrowly Chinese drama. So the reason here then that what I thought what I could do in this paper is to actually address certain issues that I think have been critical in how Chinese theater practitioners, and that is playwrights, actors, producers, publishers, and so forth, what they thought was important. So that is why I decided to hone in on certain underrepresented issues in the Western understanding of Chinese theater. So one such issue is the issue of language, right? The theatricality of language. Absolutely central, I think, in how we define this form. The other question is, the sort of, I think this goes to the question that Jeffrey raised, namely, what is the sort of representational status that is being represented here? And so I think here we see another sort of legacy at play, namely this notion that it's some kind of ethnographic excursion, into this, well, more or less exotic region of China, right? So I felt that we really need to come to a clearer understanding, as to whether how Chinese theater sort of understood its own status as revelation, as some people have argued, as representation, or as something else. So this I think is another area of of engagement. And then my final point, and then I will close there because I know my time is up, has to do with this question of audience participation. So what is it that well, what is it that is expected of audiences? There is sort of a new body of very rich research that has emerged within studies of sort of late Imperial, early modern Chinese literary culture. But anyhow, I think it's important to think through the different modalities of theatrical engagement. In other words, the sort of contract between the actors on the one hand and the audiences on the other. And my main sort of objective is through all of this is actually to show not a Chinese model, but the internal variability of what theatrical language was supposed to do, what the status of like fictionality was, and how audience engagement changed over time. And so part of the idea here is to unpack this idea that we also see reflected in this advertisement. Namely, we have something very specific. We have Broadway. We all know, roughly Broadway, right? And then the counterpart here is once again, this generalized category of Chinese. But with theater arts in particular, there is actually no Chinese, right? We have to, more than any other form, it is profoundly regional, because you adopt a regional style of singing, and that has profound ramifications for what else can be done, and what the associated expectations are. So I think so part of my purpose here is to sort of work against the sort of use of Chinese theater as a cipher. That can be tossed around in this sort of casual way. I mean, if you look at this and compare it to some of the early advertisement, you feel like we're stuck in a time warp. That nothing has happened in the last 200 years. And so this is where I'm making a case in the paper for a kind of what you might call public humanities. So in other words, that I'm now no longer wanting to, if my colleagues in Renaissance theater want to pay attention, great. But maybe, it's not actually them that I want to pay attention first and foremost. But rather perhaps my students, who are remarkably, in some ways, ignorant of this, what we might say, past, but then they're also kind of open to, new ways of thinking, to also reach cultural practitioners who may take, work that we address in such a way, or we write in such a way that they can engage with it, rather than presuming that we only talk to ourselves, or perhaps, in a futile attempt to reach our colleagues out there in other language, fields. And then perhaps, there is a case to be made to become more involved in kind of what we might call media presence for our work, in order to sort of amplify, the voices that can negotiate between, sort of broadly speaking, this broad bandwidth of, in my case now, Chinese theatrical culture and Western, or European and American, uses of same. And in that regard, I think it then becomes very clear why we should be doing this work in some ways. We don't have to go native, right? We can actually, and we don't have to, pander to theory either. We can actually be sort of these, cultural intermediaries. And I think if we do that, I think we can say, that would already be a very, sort of meaningful positionality for us to inhabit. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
Thanks so much, Pat. Yeah, public interventions, that's something that we should all be thinking about in this day and age, isn't it? So let me open it up to questions and comments. Hands. Yes, please, Jeff.
Thank you, Patricia. It's a really fascinating presentation. I wanted to pick up on one thing that you said at the end about the question of internal, sort of a commitment to the internal variability of our subjects. And it strikes me that one of the standard critiques that I'm familiar with that would be launched at sort of the big names that we associate with critical theory, whether you're talking about Foucault or Derrida, is that they were remarkably inattentive to the internal variability of the historical sources that they themselves were drawing upon when they were theorizing. And so I think one of the challenges that certainly I feel like I'm facing, and I think is maybe one of the challenges of this broader conversation, is how do we maintain the commitment to that internal variability that I think most of us really share and are really invested in, while at the same time sort of engaging in a sufficient level of generalization that we're actually able to speak,
right,
in a language that people who are engaged with that kind of theory or doing that kind of theoretical work can hear and find useful. This may be an echo of what Paula was saying about the critiques of Julian, and that's sort of a bigger question. And I'm curious what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, I'm going to give an answer that I think I could have never given, a year ago, and that will be this: to reimagine the audience. That we're actually not writing for that audience, even if we would like for them to be paying attention. So, so in editing this volume, How to Read Chinese Drama, in being sort of forced to think about undergraduates in the best possible sense as the sort of target audience. I think it had an effect that I could not have anticipated, which is to say, usually we think, okay, then we have to make it very simple, and sort of make it, more, less encumbered by, sort of technical details. But actually, I think part of it, I would say, rests in creating greater clarity rather than creating greater simplicity. And I think this is an absolute, to my mind now, an absolutely critical distinction, that clarity and simplicity, have almost nothing to do with each other. So in other words, I think partly I would say that requires that, and here I'm only speaking for myself, to digest other people's theory in such a way that it can become immediately useful. I mean, I'm very much in sympathy with the point that you raised about, art history and how we, So this concept of sort of rebuilding from the ground up. We use those tools, but to maybe use here Audre Lorde's words, we also use them to dismantle the sort of the master narrative, right? But I think if we have a kind of intermediary audience in mind, I personally ended up finding this incredibly liberating. Yeah. So.
Martin.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Martin, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Is it me? Okay. Yeah, just to that last point. I think many of us are talking to different audiences all the time. I talk to sinologists, I talk to my colleagues in Complit or Classics, and then I talk to people in China, colleagues there, students there. And it's a jarring experience because every time you switch, or I switch my lexicon, I switch my language, and it's not between Chinese and English, it's on the conceptual level. And that brings me to a question that has bothered me for a long time, and I wonder how this looks like in your field, and maybe this also goes a little bit to Jeffrey. So as far as I can tell, there is not a single Chinese or East Asian contribution to the study of literature that has succeeded globally to help us to read texts that are not Chinese. This is a great problem, right? We read Chinese texts through all sorts of lenses, but we never read, whether it's Shakespeare or whether it's Tintoretto, through Chinese eyes or Chinese concepts. So it's a one-way street, and it bothers me. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Is there anything, when you talk, about we position ourselves as intermediaries, again, only in one direction or maybe in both directions? Is there a chance to translate, to put together at least a critical vocabulary that is not our own and that could be interesting to others when they read things that are not Chinese? I know this is a huge question, sorry.
Well, okay, maybe other participants want to, chime in here as well. But so I would say at some level, I think, and this is now coming out of my work on Chinese, on the history of Chinese studies or sinology, I would say that, and other people I think are now making this argument more broadly in a variety of different fields, that the sort of Eastern, so-called Chinese and whatever, at least Eurasian cultural production has actually been intertwined for at least 400 years. So this boundary between East and West is itself, I think, something that needs to be negotiated in the manner that you describe. I guess Dominic Saxenmeier did this book on, how there's all these different conceptions of global history, for example, around, in different language areas. But fundamentally, I also think that we have to be alive of the fact that, that with the rise of the nation state, I think there has always been this desire to clean up and obfuscate the basic porousness of cultural production. So this is, I think, one aspect of a kind of caveat. Now, in terms of your second point, which is how can we become, in a way, agents, right, of what we might call broadly either localized or broadly Chinese conceptions of knowledge. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. And in some ways, I think theater is really a good opportunity for doing that. Partly because when you think about Chinese theater, there is no one term that really captures what Chinese, some people like to call it Chinese opera, which I never use for reasons that I'm not going to go into here. So there is Chinese theater, but that too, I think, is it's a kind of a stopgap measure, if you will. So yeah, so I think there. Maybe I should devote a section in the essay on this very question, right? How, where I try to instantiate a way of, okay, so what if we read, the Western theatrical tradition through the lens of this idea of what in modern Chinese now is called xiju. So yeah, so thank you for raising that issue.
Thanks. Mengjun Li, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. But I think Professor Cai raised his hands before me. So.
Oh, sorry, I didn't notice. Sure, let's go to Zong-qi then. Go ahead, Zong-qi.
No, I think the younger scholar. Okay, yeah. Yeah, you can be brief. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. So sorry for hiding behind my own picture, but Pat, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And as you know, I teach in a liberal arts college, and still early in my career, and having sort of worked with undergraduate students in the past few months in this new context, right, in terms of this sentiments, this newly re-emerging sentiments against Asians and all of that. I totally agree with what you're saying, and I feel actually very excited about, I guess, my job in a new way, for the reason that the kind of urgency that you were talking about. I guess my question is also, again, this has to do with my own positionality, being a junior scholar, a junior person in the field, right? So I kind of feel that you're calling for a reimagining of academic writing in general, or at least in our field. So it's not that we're paying more attention to writing for our undergraduate students, but rather we reimagine how we write in this field. And for me, at least so far, it has been teaching undergraduates and then writing for my colleagues and meeting the standards that the field has established. But and those two are very different types of writing and thinking. So I was just wondering if you could say a little more about that.
So, I mean, you are a contributor, right, to the How to Read Chinese Drama volume.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you participated in this experiment, right, of reimagining the audience. And insofar as the volume had to pass muster with peer reviewers, I would say, okay, first threshold cleared, then perhaps it remains to be seen, whether the undergraduates will, sort of embrace these chapters. But insofar as we've done some trial runs, I think in my experience, the undergraduates are actually hungry for work that it explains something without preempting their own sort of imaginative engagement with the material. So in other words, I think in German we say you meet them at eye level, and I think that is kind of the auf der Augenhöhe, right? So this differential that we typically imagine, I think if we can unimagine it, it really, I think, potentially liberates our own way of writing for other kinds of audiences. And I might say there, we may also, I think, as a field, try to think about writing for general audiences. I mean, something that we don't do enough of. I mean, other than the undergraduates. I mean, there's some people who do, but they're, not many. So.
Well, thanks, Pat. Let me give Zong-qi the last word, and then we'll take our somewhat delayed break.
I just want to say, I think, Pat, I hope you find time to get a paper done, because your paper will pair nicely with Paula's. Paula's deals with the earlier period, and you deal with the earlier, the contemporary period, and both involves the issue of audience, positionality, discipline, and in particular in the context of ever more intense cultural, geopolitical tension.
Right.
So I think, Papa, you can make also contribution. So this is.
I'm almost done, but I hate,
this is my comment. And,
Thank you.
And second, You know, I find myself, I'm glad to hear that you say writing a book for general audience is a truly deliberating, and that's the experience I had, not only for the poetry book, also for the prose book, and also it's tremendous boost to my own scholarship. Without doing the poetry volume to conceptualize the thing, how to explain things clearly, find a way different what is available in the English language scholarship or Chinese language scholarship, that forced me to think through a lot of issues, discover new issues, and then ended up with a series of articles and then a 2-volume Chinese book on grammar and poetic vision. Without that, how to read Chinese poetry, I could not have conceived this project. So from my own experience. And now I'm doing the same thing, and I'm making the same discoveries about prose. So I find it's a tremendously gratifying experience to myself. So speaking to audience, to general audience, is not only a professional obligation, but it's also a tremendous benefit to our own career, advancement of a scholarship. Okay, that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. So I think we should probably take a break, although we could certainly go on with this great conversation. We are running late, so I propose that we shorten the break to 15 minutes. Does that seem unreasonable? Would anyone like a little bit more time? Shall we go ahead?
Well, maybe may I take this opportunity to say good night to everyone. And I think I've already stayed longer than any time I have done in the past. So but I will watch the video, and then I will read your paper carefully and send you, share with you my thoughts. Again, thank you very much for your wonderful contribution, and so so it is really quite a regret to have to because I'm now dozing off again. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Zong-qi.
Bye, Zong-qi, and thank you, Zong-qi. Thank you very much for
Steve,
everything.
thank you. Sorry to pass the honor for you. You proposed the schedule, and then now.
It's my fault. Yes, I'm suffering too. So, but it's
okay. I'm just kidding. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Actually, I'm still on California time halfway, so I think I'm better off than you are. So great. So let's resume at about 5 minutes after the hour, and you're welcome to be eating and drinking and whatever you need to do during the session as well. So we'll resume at 05. Thanks. Thanks to everyone.